We've talked a lot about Hollywood. We talked a lot about spies. We talked about cults. But we haven't talked a lot about occult spies. Today we're going to talk about some of the cases that you may not be familiar with, where the world of intelligence overlaps with the world of cults. Mind control, rituals, brainwashing. Author Adam Mandelbaum, in his book, The Psychic Battlefield, A History of the Military and Cult Complex, writes, is not only the fact that secret societies are practiced in keeping secrets, but that their members are not unfamiliar with coded words and symbols and handshakes that make them useful for military and intelligence purposes. Many members of the Triads, the Masons, and other secret organizations have access to economic, social, and political intelligence sources that are of tremendous value for espionage purposes. Possibly, this was of great value for military and strategic tactical purposes throughout all of history. I think that is definitely the case. If we go back to the ancient world, the spy world would especially be composed of people who were, for example, errand men or postmen, the mailman for the king or for the emperor. If we think about the time of Machiavelli in his book Art of War, he talks about the military leader might need to use any kind of religious symbolism or anything that would sort of endear his troops to him, including superstition or even staged miracles, something like this, to garner the support and the spirit of his troops, so to speak. The Hashashin, the assassins in Islam, who would use drugs, use very powerful opiates to give the impression that if you had given service to to your cult leader in that regard as an assassin, that you could go directly into paradise, and the drug trip would be filled with buxomy, beautiful women and so forth, all of which was engineered as part of a religious engineering to create the Hashashin, using hashish. Right? If we think about Madame Blavatsky, who we covered the other day in our Guru live stream, old Mama Blavat, she was rumored to have been a British spy. Don't know if that's for certain, but it's definitely possible. And if you go over to Espionage History Archive, there's a great essay over there about the Tsar utilizing spies who would dress up as Buddhist monks and take trips to Tibet during the period of the Great Game when it was first starting. Now, the Soviets and the Bolsheviks made quite a use of religious engineering. For example, figures like Gleb Boki, figures like Nicholas Roerich were not only spies and working with Soviet Bolshevik intelligence, they were also very much into the occult, channeling the ascended masters. And according to Dr. Richard Spence, writer of the famous book Secret Agent 666 about Crowley, who was also a British intelligence asset for MI5, Dr. Spence argues that, in fact, Madame Blavatsky and these other Great White Brotherhood people, that their ascended masters were actually probably just other revolutionary counter-espionage handlers. So people like Giuseppe Mazzini and others were probably the real ascended masters who were speaking and giving these coded revolutionary messages, right? If we think, we go back to even the time of Queen Elizabeth, John Dee, the famous magician and magus, right, who was all into Renaissance magic and this kind of stuff, who created this Enochian magic language. Turns out John Dee was actually the first 007. He would actually sign his coded messages with the 00 and a 7, and that was a 2 balls and a cane. You can guess what 2 balls and a cane stand for, and that would later be, something prominent in Masonry. But John Dee was, of course, Queen Elizabeth's spy. She had a vast spy network, and there's paintings that you'll see of her where she's donned in a bunch of dang eyes, looking pretty creepy. And those eyes represented her vast spy network. And she would also utilize religious engineering, or the Church of England, as part of that spy network as well. If we think, as we said about Aleister Crowley, he was, as I said, an agent provocateur at the time of World War I. He was also at times engaged in missions for MI5 at the behest of Maxwell Knight, who was also an espionage handler for British intelligence. He was also an occultist, an avid fan of Crowley. He's the basis, in part at least, for James Bond's handler M. M is actually based in part on Maxwell Knight. And of course, Ian Fleming wrote all that into his novels. I don't know that Ian Fleming himself necessarily had any interest in the occult. He did put quite a few occult images in some of the Bond novels dealing with alchemy and so forth. But definitely Maxwell Knight would be another famous British intelligence person who did have an avid interest in the occult, as well as Dennis Wheatley, who wrote the Devil's Rides Out with Christopher Lee. Right? If you've read Devil Rides Out, or if you've seen the movie with Christopher Lee, then you know about the British intelligence fascination with Crowleyanism and the occult, which figures prominently with the character of Wheatley. L. Ron Hubbard, as we know, was part of naval intelligence. To some degree, it's debated exactly to what degree he was really involved in that, but he went through the ranks of Crowley's DIY cult thing, where when you graduate, you basically go on to create your own cult, and of course we get Scientology out of that. So the roots of that are the ethos and sphere of Crowley as well. Jack Parsons, who was another one of the devotees of the Crowleyan sphere, who had this falling out with L. Ron Hubbard and so forth. Jack Parsons of JPL Laboratories famously also sold secrets to other countries. So there you get another espionage and occult angle with the figure of Parsons. If we think about Colonel Michael Aquino was Anton LaVey's right-hand man for a good while in the Church of Satan. And then, of course, Michael Aquino went on to create his own satanic religion, the Temple of Set, and he also would become a important figure in defining the Army's modern doctrine of information warfare, or mind war, psi war. So you have another clear connection with Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, and that doesn't exclude Anton LaVey either. At least it's reported. I haven't verified this, but a lot of authors do contend that Anton LaVey himself was an informant, or to some degree worked with Interpol to do espionage work for some amount of time. If we think about, again, you can go back into history and come up with more important figures. In espionage, you have a relationship in some degree with occults, or the occult, or with cults or the occult. Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones itself has this very pseudo-Masonic sort of structure. It's Lodge 322. And Skull and Bones is really the origin of the American intelligence apparatus. I mean, the first generations of the OSS and the CIA are typically people recruited from Skull and Bones, people recruited out of secret societies in the Eastern Seaboard elite universities, Harvard, Yale, and so forth. If we think about other bizarre examples, there's stories that when Churchill came to power and he set up his own sort of spy network when he was running things, that he, being an avid fan of Druid thought and theology, that he combined some of this with his approach to spycraft. If you get deep into Churchill, there's also the Cambridge Apostles, the X Club. Some of those people were also interested in the darker side of the occult, and they would factor huge in the Cambridge scandal of the Cambridge Five, right? The Soviet spies, who was always questioned as to who the fifth man was for a long time. So, as you can see, there is a pretty avid, vibrant history of a connection between espionage and the occult. And another angle we could look at with this is Freemasonry itself. I mean, I tend to look at it as more of a phenomenon that worked to be the British Empire's spy network. It helped to build the empire. And in fact, mainline historians like Jessica Harlan Jacobs have written books like Builders of Empire, where she argues that this was largely the British Empire's sort of spy network. And if you watch movies like The Man Who Would Be King with Matt O'Kane and Sean Connery, you'll see that that's pretty much what they're up to, right? They're just doing these kind of like, they're sort of con men, but they're also kind of spies too. And they had done these adventures and exploits when it came to military intelligence and whatnot, and then they become con men, right? Trying to create their own religion and control a tribe. But it's a great example of this overlap that not many people know about. And we've seen it as well with the CIA. The CIA has been involved in varying capacities, according to many researchers, in different cults and occultic groups. Jonestown wasn't really occultic, but it did have a very cultic vibe and a very dark philosophy, obviously. And when we think about other cults as well, we can see sometimes these intelligence networks kind of being in the background, or at least having some degree of interest or connection to these groups. For example, going all the way back to the Hellfire Club, Sir Francis Dashwood and Benjamin Franklin were engaged in quite a few orgies and quite a few wild, lascivious parties. And they were also, at least in Franklin's case, I think Franklin was pretty much a spy too. So you can see a connection there between the occult and the spy craft that Franklin was engaged in. But there's quite a bit more to this. To go over to my website, Jay's Analysis, or to Rockfin, to my channel there, and we're going to do a full lecture going deep into this. We're going to go deep into the Cambridge Five. We're going to go deep into many other cases, some of the documents, the SRI remote viewing. We're going to go deep into the connections between the U.S. military and the black arts, studies that the military has done on black magic, on psyops and psy-war, using superstition, voodoo, and so forth. We'll look at that, the many instances and cases of that, and stuff that's a little more not appropriate, we should say, for YouTube. Everybody should be familiar with The CIA and Mind Control, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks. So that book is necessary. It's essential to understanding globalism. Kessler, right? Hungarian expatriate, raised up to the highest levels of the Royal Society, given the order of the British Empire. Straight up Luciferian, right? And I cover the bizarre statements in Ghost in the Machine. Check out my Ghost in the Machine lecture. The full talk is devastating, I would say, because he literally says there's nothing wrong with cannibalism. This is what caused man to evolve past the slime state, out of the monkey state, Neanderthal state, required eating your BFF. That's just part of evolution. So we marvel at the idea of child sacrifice and these things as if this was far-fetched, when the people who are the so-called intelligentsia of our planet talk about it openly. They say that we should do it. And then, by the way, how does Kessler end the book? By saying that we should manipulate DNA and RNA in women's eggs to make sure that they don't give birth. And we should use vaccines and tap water, he says at the end of the book. Big pharma pills. And he says this is all alchemy at the very end of the book. He says it's an alchemical, transhumanist, mad scientist concoction. And that's what we're doing as a top globalist. So that, once again, another admission. And isn't that interesting, because another figure lauded as a hero of the world, a hero of the world, right? Jonas Salk. And yet Jonas Salk writes not giant books, but 200-page books, I guess you could say. The Survival of the Wisest, where he also, like Arthur Kessler, says we should, through vaccinations, inoculations, and messing with pregnant women, screw up their eggs and experiment on them and basically make everybody into retards. And then the retards won't ever get laid, and there won't be new people, because the retards will be boys with titties and girls with dickies, and you can't get those people to reproduce, because basically you'll have retarded social justice warrior. I'm not joking. This is literally what he says in the book. We'll get retarded social justice warrior kids, and then they won't mate, and that'll reduce population. So the great hero, the father of modern inoculations, says let's use inoculations to screw up women's embryos and make a bunch of tards. And you're called crazy if you talk about that. I had the Daily Beast guy who defends vaccines called me crazy on Twitter. And I said, are you telling me that Jonas Salk did not write that book? And at first, he wasn't even aware that Jonas Salk had written this book. He looked it up, and he replied and said, well, I guess he did write it, but you are lying about it. Yeah, that's how it goes. I must be lying about it because the guy didn't even know Jonas Salk had written, the supposed defender of vaccines for the Daily Beast. Didn't even know Jonas Salk had this book. Too dumb to even know that. Goes and looks it up, realizes he was wrong. And so the only thing he can say is, I must be lying about what is the content of the book. When the damn book is titled Survival of the Wisest. Come on. That's how these people are. They're liars. And they lie to themselves and they convince themselves that they're liars. What's the name of the book? Survival of the Wisest. Jonas Salk. I also did an important talk on Edward Bernays' propaganda. And I read and covered the whole book and the neat stories and insights from Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who went from being at the Department of Defense to advertising. Isn't that interesting? Direct connect between advertising and psychological warfare. The next book, Scientific Outlook, very important, by Bertrand Russell, another member of the Royal Society. We seem to keep coming back to these Royal Society characters, and we noticed that the great champion of scientism had about 50 different definitions, very elastic, as to what science is. Bertrand Russell told us science is knowledge. Science is what began with Galileo. Science is basic empiricism. Science is progress. Science is power manipulating nature. Science is all-powerful and omnipotent. That's literally what he says in the book. Science is based on assumptions that are unverified, but it's still the best that we can do because it's empirical. Science is basically a mystical cult, and it replaces religion. And Russell goes on many, many times to explain the new religion of scientism quite openly. Again, in this book, we have the promise of diet, injections, injunctions, and technocracy basically depopulating and screwing everybody up. Through public education, we covered his other book, The Impact of Science on Society, which was several years later, a couple decades later after Scientific Outlook, and it includes many of the same ideas. It includes the idea that there will have to be a world government in place to screw up women's wombs and to make sure that they don't keep reproducing. Isn't that interesting that Kessler, Salk, Russell, they all talk about messing up reproduction in women's wombs. But they're not the only ones. Guess who else talked about it? H.G. Wells, even prior to Bertrand Russell. We did Open Conspiracy by H.G. Wells, where H.G. Wells says that the global technocracy is an open conspiracy. It's to be installed openly. Everybody will know about it. The globalists will talk about it. And they're going to have to use both the communist Marxists and the idiot libertarians who think that they're fighting the system when they're actually some of the greatest tools of the system. That's actually what we're going to see in Jacques Attali as well, with the market god that they worship. But H.G. Wells said a long time ago that the libertarians, free trade, and open borders would be what would be key to bringing in the global order. And we're going to see that in Attali. So Attali is just going to be basically a present-day version of what we saw with H.G. Wells, with Huxley, right, with all those guys, Kessler, Russell, and then the living present-day instantiation of this sort of satanic succession that we have here with these characters would be someone like Jacques Attali. We covered the Grand Chessboard. We covered Brzezinski's books, if you recall. There are about 3 or 4 or 5, maybe even, different talks where we covered the works of Brzezinski. And Brzezinski just passed away, so he no longer counts as living globalist. But Brzezinski represents, just like Kissinger, the Rockefeller, Atlanticist, Rothschild interests. He's one of their brains, the bloods and the brains, right? And Rothschild and Rockefeller, certainly have have ruled both sides of the Atlantic pretty clearly. These are central globalist texts. And in the Between Two Ages text, we discuss the weather warfare, ELF, VLF manipulation that Brzezinski was very candid about back in the 70s and how this would be used. And what did we just see this week? Homeland Security accidentally leaks ELF, VLF, mind control technology that could be used remotely. Supposedly it's accidental leak. We already knew that for a long time. And if you listen to Jay's analysis, you knew about that a long time because Brzezinski talked about it back in the 1970s in Between Two Ages. In Between Two Ages is about the coming technocracy. So if you want to look for common themes that we've seen in the globalist book series that none of them disagree on at all, it's global depopulation, the need for a global economy and global order in terms of central economic planning and technocracy, and the Darwinian assumption. No globalist disagrees about Darwinism. Why? Because they all situate globalism within the scheme of this being a necessary, determined evolutionary process. Why? We're just evolving from the ancient tribal period, which succeeded the ancient Neanderthal period, to the monotheistic imperial period, to the tech atheist globalist period, which will lead to the transhumanist utopia. You see, it's just natural. It's just determined. That's where it all goes. But H.G. Wells's nonfiction is pretty straightforward and pretty total globalist, Marxist, communist, supported by bankers, straight up. Charles Galton Darwin is more sci-fi in his nonfiction than H.G. Wells is. Because he wrote The Next Million Years. And I thought that talk came out really good. It was fascinating to see what he says. He mentions weather control. He mentions screwing up mass infanticide. He mentions messing up reproduction. He mentions controlling all that as well. Everything that we saw in all the other talks, because they think they're going to commandeer Darwinian evolution. You can just control it like a PlayStation controller. You just grab it and you start controlling evolution, and you can turn it to the utopia to come. And what's ironic is that all of these people pushing the utopia are quite candid as well, that you, average man out there, you regular person, you have no stake in this. You will die. You will pass away. But as H.G. Wells says, why not give your life for something greater than yourself? In fact, it's almost kind of a religious commitment of sacrifice. And even though we know the religions are false, why not give yourself to globalism? Just accept that. Come down to the altar here. Miles Copeland's Game of Nations. And yes, this is the relative of Stuart Copeland of the Police. Did you know Miles Copeland, relative of Stuart Copeland, was a high-level CIA operative and wrote famous books about his CIA operative escapades? And I cover Game of Nations in depth. Again, 300 pages. And we're going to talk about Jacques Attali. And this is a crazy book. I mean, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't expect the many admissions, which is always how it is. You go to these books and they kind of blow you away at what they admit, because it's way beyond what you admit. And he begins his book, as I mentioned, I think in another talk, with the idea of crisis, right? All the globalist books start out with crisis. There's a crisis, and we're here to fix it. Now, rarely do they mention that a lot of these crises are crises that they engineered. You get that in Quigley, right, where he talks about the crises of the 20th century. The tragedy of the 20th century is all the wars. And then the hope is democratic globalism, right? And then he later says, yes, so the bankers started the wars. They were behind the wars. So in a way, they engineered the tragedy. But don't think about that. Worry about the hope. Think about the hope. There's hope. And that's what Attali does, is begin his book. And he says, we're going to talk about the future history. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, not just between now and 2050, but between 2050 and 2100. 100, right? These lunatics. So it's a book of futurism, and it always has to begin with crisis. And what are the crises? Well, guess what? It's the same crises as all the other globalist books. Overpopulation, right? The tired old leftist crises. Let's see what they are. Birth rates. Peak oil. There's not enough energy to feed all of these people their soy. It's not enough energy for all the gamers to play their PlayStations. Terrorism. Yes, terror. Rogue states and dictators. Oh yes, those pesky Kim Jong-uns that we are so worried about. That's another crisis that Jacques Attali is going to tell us. We can send Dennis Rodman over there with his green hair and wedding dress, dressing like a woman, and he can go hang out with Kim Jong-un. But we have to worry about Kim Jong-un's nukes. But we'll send Dennis Rodman over there. Yeah, this is all very real, folks. Very real. The U.S. will destroy itself through its own idiocy. Now, that's true, probably, but not in the sense that Jacques Attali means. He says the end of the U.S. is 2035. The U.S. will collapse from its own internal failures. In other words, not accepting more liberalism, which is what's causing the failures. That's what he says will lead to the failure. And then we will have the introduction of the era of the technological austerity. Tech austerity. You will be forced into communal collective living, and there will be limits on all of your production and consumption and commercial artifacts. Wow. Wow. That is the essence of the globalist plan right there. And he's going to be very candid. He's not going to hold back. He's going to say exactly what, not just what he projects. Come on. We're not naive here. We know this is not your French crystal ball, right? No. This is the plan. He says music itself will be global. The arts will be global. And music and the arts being global is what will spread globalism. Like a church, like evangelism. Global trance, global DJs. You're listening to Armin van Buren. Global trance. Global trance DJs will bring the New World Order, according to Jacques Attali. Now, he begins the book by saying this. That was the foreword, and he begins by saying there were three powers, and they became gods in the ancient world, and this is what led to the forces that move society. Okay, so the three powers or forces are the religious, the military, and the merchant, he says. And these three powers were so powerful that they were ascribed divinity. So the gods, right, the religious, the military, you had the military gods, the heroes, right, your Achilles, etc., and the merchants, the money power, gold, right, the gods of gold and silver. And he says that in the ancient world, these three powers were kind of vying at times. So sometimes the military power would fight against the money power, and maybe they would all fight against the religious. But these are the three powers that have fought throughout history and moved history. And he says, guess what? Cannibalism was natural. There were nomads. We had nomads, and they were cannibals, and that's what led to evolution. Isn't that interesting? Because Richard Dawkins just said it's time to remove our taboo when it comes to human meat. It's time to eat. And you can see him thirsting for the human meat that he probably eats late at night at his Sabbath services, his midnight woods gatherings where he eats dead babies. You can see Kessler saying, What's wrong with cannibalism? It was just natural. And again, we have to ask the idiot theistic evolutionists who think that this all meshes together. Do you also, theistic evolutionists, accept the idea that cannibalism is natural? Gender roles are not natural. They just evolved. They're not social conventions per se, but they're evolutionary conventions, and they could evolve to be the opposite of themselves. So the promotion of SJW tranny trans world, there's nothing wrong with that because it's just natural phenomena. Anything that happens is natural. Even if I, as a mad scientist, take Bill Cosby DNA and inject it into my daughter, and she becomes a tranny Bill Cosby daughter of mine, a half Cosby, half girl, half white, and then I inject some RuPaul just to get frisky with it, get crazy with it, and then I inject some soy to give it, no, we don't want to give it soy, we want to give it testosterone, because it's a girl going to boy, or in between thereabouts. I create the great Baphomet hermaphrodite that is a Bill Cosby creation, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's no violation of any natural laws, because in this paradigm, anything that happens is by definition natural. It's all just evolutionary process, right? Well, the same goes for gender roles. There's nothing inherent about gender, because gender just evolved. And by the way, how did gender evolve? Since gender is something that only consummates within a lifespan, right, of 80, 100 years for a human being. But so how it would have taken millions of years for two specific genders to evolve, which would have been pointless because you have to mate within the span of, right, 100 years if you're a male or female. So you have a half dick or 1/8 of a dick. That's not going to reproduce. You can't reproduce with 1/8 of a dick and 1/67 of a vagina. All right. The 1/80th breast does not milk. The teats, the 1/80th teats do not milk. Therefore, gender roles do not evolve. They're inherent in beings, but not on the Jacques Attali paradigm. And then he progressed to the market economy, right, when he got into the Enlightenment and all this stuff, and libertarianism. By the way, that's what these guys think. And it's only rational that he would grow out of his libertarian stage and his market stage and into world socialist stage. You see, now this is why Marx is so important, because Marx, roughly speaking, you have this historical materialism that is in a dialectical process towards global utopia. Right? The great libertarian state is the promise of Marxism. The state will wither away eventually because everybody will be free to do whatever they want. And yes, Marx is a libertarian. So, and by the way, Attali is all about libertarianism. Are you aware of that? Do you understand that Marxism and libertarianism are two sides of the same coin? And not only does Marx illustrate that in his policies and teachings, but so do modern Marxists like Jacques Attali. This whole book is all about capitalism as the force which brings globalism. Now, guess who else said that? H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells said, "Hey, dumb libertarian," or he said, "Hey, dumb Marxists, don't you realize that it's only capitalism that has the force to bring about the global market, which will bring about the global government?" And guess what? Jacques Attali says the exact same thing. Capitalism is what will bring the global world order. He goes through a bunch of stuff, all of which was just to say that it's prepping the way for the rise of the merchant class. And the rise of the merchant class is concomitant with the rise of the individual, the atomistic individual. And this book is going to culminate with the atomistic individual getting his ultimate comeuppance in transhumanism, when you will be free to accept your gender, your species, your whatever, not just in terms of physical operations on your ding dong, your Huang, but also in the virtual realm, right? And he's going to talk about all that. So capitalism ends up being the dominant force as we come through the Enlightenment, Protestant Reformation, Scientific Revolution, right? And isn't it interesting? It's also concomitant with the rise of Freemasonry. What comes at the same time as the rise of capitalism? Freemasonry, all throughout Europe and then all throughout the globe. And what do they do? What does the banking Masonic power do in all the countries? They get rid of the church and they get rid of the monarchies. And what do? They install democratic republics. And the East India Company, of course, right? Dutch East India, British East India. This comes to the fore. And guess what? They were all Freemasons too. I was looking at T.H. Huxley's book, which is another one of the globalist books that we'll do, about the history of man, and which is his defense. It's the first defense of transspecies mutation for Darwinism is actually T.H. Huxley's book. Did you know that? It's not Darwin. It's T.H. Huxley's book that first said the ape men magically transformed into the humans. For Attali, he moves, through your modern Western history to the rise of London and the British as an empire. British East India Company, this is an early form of the rise of the corporation, the modern corporate state. And London as a city-state, really gets its power from both this and from banking, right? And what is the great idea of the Anglo establishment? Liberty, 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 liberty. But what does it mean? Well, we don't worry about that. We just chant liberty all day. Don't worry about what it actually means. It's a slogan. And then we get from London our other great hero, right? The supposed opponent of the market and liberty and capitalism, our other friend direct from London, Karl Marx and Engels, right? And Engels funded Karl Marx his whole life from his stock money. Engels, the wealthy stock trader, funding Marx, the Marxist. Did you know Marx was a Marxist? And interesting side note, he mentions the Suez Canal, which is a big part of how the British Empire had its power, was controlling that trade route, and that was all a trick of the Rothschilds. I believe it was Disraeli who got the Suez Canal for the Rothschilds, and that's how the British Empire had so much power, and he kind of touches on that. Big industries and electricity, Henry Ford, the invention of the engine. These are the next big phases after industrialization. And this is what's taking us. You see what he's doing here is giving his scope of history, and he's telling you where it's got to go, right? And this is what we've seen so many times from these globalists, is that we know where the future is going because it just has to go this way. It just has to be a giant transhumanist dystopia because that's just evolution, you see. Oh, I thought evolution was empirical science. Oh, no. You see, evolution is everybody has to die and become trannies and become retards, and the elite, live on floating islands or something. That's evolution too, right? Don't limit evolution to something that is just empirical science, which, by the way, it's not. But as he moves into discussing the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the way, he did mention Tesla, by the way, and Tesla's electricity and Tesla's revolutionary ideas changing the world. Sanitation changes the world, of course, and he's saying capitalism is the driver of all this, you see. And the USSR fails because it's not liberal. And he praises Gorbachev, which is interesting because Gorbachev tried to make it liberal. And this is something I've said for a long time, and here I finally found a globalist saying it. Jacques Attali says that California is a test bed for what the rest of America and the world gets years later. Yeah, I've always thought that because I grew up in California and then moved. And then you would see the trends in California hit the rest of the country 20 years later. Well, Jacques Attali says that California, a giant military-industrial complex state, is basically a big lab rat arena, a big test tube. And how long have we said that? All the interviews with John and Chris at Hoaxbusters. How many times have we said that? John has many interviews detailing this. We've talked about this many times. And he says California creates this nomadic existence. People come to California thinking they're going to be movie stars. There's going to be, he said, all the way back to when they was digging gold, right? Kanye, gold digger. People were digging golds in gold mines thinking they were going to get panhandling shit. Rusty old panhandlers. Fast forward to Lady Gaga, right? It's all Los Angeles. And it has this appeal, and he says that this is the model of the megalopolis to draw everybody in. Right? He says this is what we'll do. And by the way, so he's basically saying what we've said for many years. Megalopolises, metropolises are social engineering. Did you know that? Now, there's a sense in which, yes, they naturally just grew up out of, their location being on a river, usually for trade. I realize that cities have always, but did you know that city planning is also studied from the globalist perspective? Brzezinski talks about this in Between Two Ages as a way to re-engineer and control society. And when you get people into the mega cities and their coffin apartments, that is social engineering that people plan out. Did you know that? That's why they're planning NEOM, the big smart city. That's why they're planning Google cities, right? Smart cities. Is this very thing. And guess what? Jacques Attali says, yes, it is a plan. And he says that there will be a billion people will live in the megalopolises. You'll have one giant megalopolis, like on the new Judge Dredd movie, right? Where billions of people live in these giant high rises, and you have a little coffin that you live in. Like you see in China, like you see people have like a broom closet apartment that they live in. And he says that's going to be the norm for everybody. That's where they want to take everyone. And Jacques Attali says that. So here you go. This is total proof. But now we're not there yet. We're not into the future yet. We're still coming into the 80s. And California in the 80s, he says, is really the test bed for the introduction of the American dystopia. Maybe that's why we all like dystopian retro wave stuff, is that there's something about that. There's something connecting it to, the 1980s in Los Angeles, like John Carpenter's Escape from LA, right? Maybe I need to do an analysis of Escape from New York and Escape from LA, because I think John Carpenter's telling us something there. But this is interesting because he says that Silicon Valley out in California creating these gadgets, the computer and then the Walkman. Well, Sony created the Walkman, but you know what I'm saying, like the iPod and so forth, which evolves into the iPhone and the iPad. And what he says, these gadgets are nomad objects. Isn't that interesting? Why are they nomad objects? Well, Jacques Attali says they're nomad objects because they get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they allow people to transfer their identity and meaning to this little object that they carry around. And so when they've done that, they can become rootless, and you can nomadically move them like migrants across the globe, because they'll go to work 1,000 miles away in some city for 5 years, and then they'll move to another city 5 years later to work, and they'll do this throughout their whole lives, and they'll never plant themselves, get rooted, right? And he says it's because of these cell phones, believe it or not. That's what he says. Nomad devices will create a rootless, deracinated population that will just easily up and move to the next hellhole to make an extra 5 credits every week. And that's what the plan of the cell phone and the net was to create this thing. And guess what? I didn't know this. What was the first website to go up on the World Wide Web? It wasn't Everything Is Terrible. It wasn't Moms on the Net. It was CERN. The mysterious, Masonic, occultic CERN was the very first website to go public in 1991 on August 6th. This is according to our friend Jacques. But Attali is saying, California, man. California, dude. The Californians. They are the test bed for the rest of the country to create the dystopia and the nomadic idiots, the nomads, the deracinated, rootless people, the millions and millions of people to be moved like pawns on a chessboard, the grand chessboard. Weapons of mass migration. That's what he says. So I was not expecting him to say that. That was the thing that surprised me. And how does he explain it? He says, democracy cannot exist without market democracy. And this is what you will see everywhere. Everywhere, the planetary system will move towards liberalism. The West and America will be deindustrialized. And he says by 2030, the end of the U.S. by 2030. And the housing collapse, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac signaled the unsustainability of the American economy based on debt. The giant, massive debts that are run up are unsustainable and this kind of stuff. It's not going to last. But guess what? It's the same people who have the Attali type worldview, the globalists, who are the ones who say run up giant debts, right? So come on, this is a bit disingenuous. The coming national deconstruction, when the nation states will be deconstructed. And he says that everybody will be moved into coffin houses and into giant megalopolises like you see in Judge Dredd, after everyone has been made rootless through their iPhones and their iPads and their devices. After several decades, they'll become deracinated, rootless, and they will be hypersexualized and made into sicko pervs, tranny weirdos. And he says that the cell phone will do this through the exaltation of their ego. Wow. That's page 121. And then he says there will be laws enacted globally about the house size that you can have. They're already doing this in Germany. They're saying that you can't have certain size houses and all this garbage. And that, by the way, is to limit population. And that's what Attali says. There will be cryptocurrencies, currencies that are outside of the realm of nation states, and this will just be a means toward globalism. Now, I'm not saying that every sense of cryptocurrency is necessarily bad. There's nothing inherently bad. Attali is just saying that this is an aspect of globalism. Netflix and chill, or Netflix and kill. Ooh, what am I talking about? Well, he's saying that the things that you will have an abundance of in the dystopia is entertainment. He says you'll have plenty of entertainment, and everything will be insured. You'll basically be a big baby with an iPad dangling from your crib, is what you'd be like Wall-E. You'll be floating around in the scooters, drinking your blue slushies and watching your porn sites all day. And you'll be happy because you're actually just a lab rat in a giant smart city test tube, right? And that's another book we're going to cover in the Globalist book series, World as Laboratory by Rebecca Limov. And here's a crazy thing. Jacques Attali says he predicts what we're doing right now. He predicts YouTube live streams. Can you believe that? Page 125, he predicts YouTube live streams, and he says that this is the new way of doing entertainment in the future. YouTube live streams. He says individual artists will create their own projects online, and they'll have to get their own funding. And the old systems of, record companies and all that crap, that'll pass away, and it'll all be controlled by Google. And there will be global internet by 2030, maybe. He says they're going to try it by 2030. Because once there's global internet, you can have total nomadic ubiquity. Oh, you thought the global internet was so that you could tweet anywhere in the world. No. They're not giving you Twitter and Facebook and all this stuff so that you can just have fun everywhere. It's to create the ability for everybody to be nomadically moved everywhere and anywhere. That's what Attali says. And in order to do that, you need global internet everywhere. Once everyone has been made rootless, then the globalists will give you a new meaning and culture, worse, useless consumerism and garbage. The gamification of society, the rise of virtual reality, all mentioned, all part of the plan. And what's the end goal? Guess what? Social justice warrior stuff. Depopulation and social justice. Create depopulation and an army of social justice warriors. Everything that we talk about. Migration and mass migration, population warfare, he discusses on pages 130, 131. And then he says the megacities, the megalopolises of tomorrow is the goal. Because once you've got everybody packed into the giant ant city, right? Giant ant colony of living in these megacities, you can control them. Because if you say a bad word, you will have your porn cut off that month. You will get your credits cut off, and you won't get your social approval will go down according to the AI smart city grid that runs everything. And you think it's bad now with like Facebook banning you for 8 months. Imagine when the mega AI super corporate company of the future cuts off your food rations for a month. That's what they want. And that's what he says. And he says, here's the key point that we'll end this section with. The world will be increasingly filled with people who have become anonymous by their own free choice. It will be like a giant carnival where everyone, through ultimate freedom, will have chosen a new identity for himself. That is the globalist plan. And for all those idiot libertarians out there who think that capitalism is fighting globalism, Jacques Attali says, no, your capitalist consumerism will be applied to every area of life, and everybody will think that they're free and choosing their own identities when in fact they're choosing to be nothing. They're choosing to negate themselves. That is the goal. Not to give you the freedom to choose your own identity, but for you to self-destruct in rejecting your actual identity. And that's not just who you are ethnically speaking or religiously speaking. They mean even your gender. And what do you see nowadays? Right? The rise of the tranny state, the trapno state. Right? That is exactly what the globalists want. And we will see that explicated as Jacques Attali projects what happens not just by 2030, but by 2050 and 2100